To step into the Middle Ages is to step into a world where the biological clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. Today we live in a cushioned reality. We have the luxury of worrying about long-term cholesterol, microplastics, or retirement funds. But 1,000 years ago, the horizon of the future was often no further than the next sunrise. In this era, death was not an intruder. It was the landlord. If you were an ordinary person in the 11th or 12th century, you were walking through a gauntlet of lethal traps, many of which were invisible, and most of which could end your story in a matter of heartbeats. Let us begin with the most common way to die, simply being thirsty. In the modern world, water is life. In the Middle Ages, water was often a lethal cocktail. We have to dispel the myth that people only drank ale because they knew the water was bad. They often drank water because they had no choice. But the Blue Death, or cholera, was waiting in every communal well. Imagine a bustling medieval market town. There is no sewage system. Human waste, animal carcasses, and toxic runoff from tanneries, where hides were soaked in acid and urine, all filtered into the groundwater. You take one drink from a cool-looking stream. Within 6 hours, your world collapses. Cholera doesn't just make you sick, it hollows you out. It triggers a level of fluid loss that the human frame was never meant to endure. Your blood becomes as thick as molasses. Your heart beats against a dry chest, and your skin loses all elasticity. By the time the sun sets, you aren't just dead. You are a mummified version of the person you were at breakfast. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a Tuesday. If the water didn't get you, your own dinner table would. For the peasantry, bread was the literal sun around which their life orbited. But nature is a cruel god. In particularly wet, cold years, a tiny horn-shaped fungus called ergot would infect the rye. This led to St. Anthony's fire. This is perhaps the most terrifying way to go because it attacks both the body and the mind simultaneously. Within hours of eating tainted bread, you would feel a tingling in your fingers. Soon, it feels as if your limbs are being thrust into a furnace. The toxins constricted blood vessels so tightly that gangrene sets in while you are still walking. Your hands and feet would literally rot and fall off, a process the chronicles described as the limbs being eaten by holy fire. But it didn't stop there. Ergot is a precursor to LSD. As your body decayed, your mind would dissolve into a waking nightmare of demons, celestial fire, and screaming shadows. You died in a state of absolute drug-induced terror, often in less than 48 hours. We often romanticize medieval warfare, the clash of steel, and the glory of the charge. But the fastest killer on the battlefield wasn't the sword. It was the dirt on the blade. Or even worse, the dirt on your own skin. In a world without the concept of germs, a scratch from a bramble while foraging or a nick from a kitchen knife was a high-stakes gamble. Sepsis was the silent reaper. It could turn a minor inflammatory response into a full-body shutdown in a day and a half. One day you have a red streak on your arm, the next your organs are failing as your blood turns into a river of poison. Then there was tetanus, or the lockjaw. If you stepped on a rusted nail or were bitten by a farm animal, the bacteria would produce a toxin that attacked your nervous system. Your muscles would begin to spasm with such incredible force that they would literally tear themselves off the bone. Your jaw would lock in a permanent, agonizing grin, and your back would arch until your spine snapped. You would remain fully conscious, unable to scream, until your respiratory muscles seized and you suffocated in total silence. Even staying inside your home was a death trap. Medieval houses were essentially tinderboxes. Thick, thatched roofs, floors covered in dry rushes that hid years of grease and waste, and an open hearth in the center of the room with no chimney, only a hole in the roof. If a spark hit the thatch while you were sleeping, you had roughly 90 seconds to escape before the entire structure became a furnace. Thousands died not from flames, but from smoke inhalation in their sleep, their lungs seared by the carbon monoxide of their own burning homes. And then there were the industrial hazards of the home. Women were often the victims of the lye death. To make soap or clean clothes, people used lye, a caustic chemical made from wood ash. One accidental spill on the skin led to chemical burns that no medieval medicine could treat. One accidental swallow by a child meant a localized, agonizing destruction of the throat and stomach. In the Middle Ages, even the act of cleaning was a dance with the grave. We cannot talk about fast death without the Black Death. While the plague took about 3 to 5 days to kill, there was a variant that was much faster, the pneumonic plague. If the bacteria jumped from the lymph nodes to the lungs, it became airborne. You didn't need a flea bite anymore. You just needed to breathe the same air as a sick person. Once the bacteria hit your lungs, the clock accelerated. You would start coughing up bright, frothy blood. Your body temperature would spike to lethal levels, and your lungs would essentially dissolve into liquid. From the first cough to the final breath, the pneumonic plague could end a life in less than 24 hours. It was so fast that chronicles report people sitting down to dinner with their families and being dead before the meal was over. Why does this matter to us today? Why do we obsess over these gruesome ends? It's because we live in the first era of human history that has forgotten how fragile life is. We have replaced the fast death with the slow decline. We fear the long road of aging, while our ancestors feared the sudden shadow. The medieval person knew that every morning they woke up was a miracle. They didn't have 5-year plans because they weren't sure they had a 5-day guarantee. This created a culture of intense, raw presence. When they ate, they tasted it. When they loved, they meant it. When they prayed, they screamed it. We look at their fast deaths and feel pity. But perhaps they would look at our long lives, spent in front of screens, filled with low-grade stress and deferred joy, and feel a different kind of pity. They lived in a world where the reaper was always at the shoulder, and that made the light of life shine 1,000 times brighter. They didn't have time to be bored. They only had time to be alive, right up until the very second they weren't.